In a quiet, suburban neighborhood, life moved at a predictable pace. The streets were lined with neatly trimmed hedges, colorful flower beds, and freshly painted mailboxes. Every house looked like it belonged in a magazine, thanks to the strict rules set by the Homeowners Association, HOA. This was a place where people took pride in their surroundings, where children rode bikes on smooth sidewalks and neighbors exchanged polite smiles during morning walks. Among the residents lived Marcus Johnson, a 16-year-old boy who had recently discovered his love for skateboarding. For Marcus, skateboarding wasn't just a hobby, it was an escape. It gave him a sense of freedom that he didn't always feel in the tightly controlled environment of his neighborhood. He spent hours practicing tricks in the cul-de-sac near his house, perfecting ollies, kickflips, and grinds. To him, the sound of wheels rolling over pavement was music, and every successful trick felt like a small victory. Marcus's father, David Johnson, watched his son's passion grow with quiet pride. Unlike many fathers in the neighborhood, David wasn't the type to brag about his accomplishments or dominate conversations at barbecues. Instead, he kept to himself, focusing on raising Marcus and supporting his dreams. What most people didn't know about David was that he had once been one of the best in his field, an elite special forces operative. After years of serving overseas, he had retired from active duty and now worked as a private security consultant. But to the neighbors, he was simply Mr. Johnson, a hardworking dad who mowed his lawn on weekends and coached Marcus's Little League team. On this particular afternoon, the sun hung high in the sky, casting golden rays over the neighborhood. Birds chirped cheerfully and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of towering oak trees. Marcus grabbed his skateboard and headed outside, eager to practice before dinner. As he reached the cul-de-sac, he dropped his board onto the pavement and began gliding back and forth, building momentum for his tricks. The rhythmic clatter of wheels echoed through the air, blending with the sounds of nature. At first, everything seemed normal. A few kids played catch in a nearby yard, and an elderly woman watered her flowers. But then, a familiar sight appeared, a white golf cart emblazoned with the HOA logo. Behind the wheel sat Carl Hargrove, the self-appointed enforcer, of all things orderly. Carl was a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a perpetually scowling expression. He prided himself on knowing every rule in the HOA handbook and enforcing them with unrelenting vigor. Whether it was reminding someone to remove holiday decorations 2 days late or issuing fines for cars parked too close to fire hydrants, Carl made sure everyone followed the rules. No exceptions. As Carl drove closer, his eyes locked onto Marcus. Slowing down, he parked his cart near the curb and stepped out, adjusting his belt as if preparing for battle. "Hey, kid," he called out, his voice sharp and authoritative. "What do you think you're doing?" Marcus stopped skating and turned to face him. "Just practicing some tricks," he replied politely. "Is there a problem?" Carl crossed his arms and frowned. "There's a noise ordinance in this neighborhood," he said sternly. "Skateboarding counts as disruptive activity. You need to stop right now." Marcus blinked in surprise. He had never heard of such a rule, but he didn't want to argue. "Okay, no problem," he said, picking up his skateboard. "I'll head home." But Carl wasn't satisfied. Something about Marcus's casual dismissal irked him. Maybe it was the teenager's calm demeanor. Or maybe it was the fact that Marcus hadn't immediately cowered under his authority. Whatever the reason, Carl decided to press further. "Hold on a second," he snapped, following Marcus as he walked toward, his driveway. "You can't just ignore the rules whenever you feel like it. Do you even know what disruptive means?" Marcus sighed inwardly, but kept walking. He didn't want to engage in a pointless argument. Unfortunately, Carl wasn't ready to let it go. As they reached Marcus's driveway, Carl did something unexpected and dangerous. Reaching into his jacket pocket, he pulled out a handgun and pointed it at Marcus. "Don't move," he ordered, his voice trembling with anger. "This is serious business." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Marcus stood rooted to the spot, his heart pounding in his chest. He had seen guns in movies and video games, but nothing could have prepared him for the raw fear of having one aimed directly at him. His mind raced, searching for a way to defuse the situation. Meanwhile, Carl continued ranting about HOA regulations and how Marcus needed to learn respect. Unbeknownst to both of them, someone else had been watching the entire scene unfold. Inside the Johnson household, David had returned home earlier than usual that day. From the living room window, he noticed Carl's golf cart parked suspiciously close to their driveway. Curious, he peeked outside and saw the confrontation between his son and the HOA officer. At first, David assumed it was a minor disagreement. Neighbors often complained about noise or parking issues, and these disputes usually resolved themselves without drama. But when Carl drew his weapon, David's instincts kicked in. Years of military training had taught him to assess situations quickly and act decisively. Without hesitation, he grabbed his phone to record the interaction, ensuring there would be evidence if things escalated further. Then, moving with quiet determination, David stepped onto the porch. His presence alone commanded attention, though. He remained calm and composed. "Officer," he called out, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "What seems to be the problem here?" The question startled both Carl and Marcus. Turning around, Carl found himself face to face with David, whose piercing gaze left little room for misinterpretation. Gone was the mild-mannered neighbor. In his place stood a man exuding authority and control. For the first time, Carl realized he might have underestimated the situation and the people involved. Carl's grip on the handgun tightened as he turned to face David. His initial confidence faltered under the weight of the man's commanding presence. David stood tall, his broad shoulders squared and his expression unreadable. Though dressed in a simple t-shirt and jeans, there was something about him that demanded respect, something Carl couldn't quite place but instinctively feared. "This is none of your business," Carl stammered, trying to regain control of the situation. "I'm handling a violation of HOA rules." He gestured vaguely toward Marcus, who still stood frozen near the driveway, clutching his skateboard like a lifeline. David didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes locked onto Carl's. "A violation?" he repeated calmly, his tone measured but firm. "And this requires you to pull out a weapon? On a child?" The word child hung heavily in the air. It wasn't accusatory or angry. It was factual. And yet it struck Carl harder than any insult could have. For the first time, he glanced at Marcus and seemed to truly see him. A teenager wearing baggy jeans and a hoodie, holding nothing more threatening than a skateboard. The absurdity of the moment hit Carl like a punch to the gut, but instead of backing down, his pride kicked in. He straightened his posture and raised his chin defiantly. "These rules are in place for a reason," Carl snapped, waving the gun, slightly for emphasis. "If people don't follow them, chaos ensues. I'm just doing my job." David's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Your job doesn't include pointing firearms at kids," he said. "Holster the weapon, Carl, now." It was clear from his tone that this wasn't a request. It was an order. And while Carl might not have recognized the authority behind it, his subconscious did. There was something unmistakably military about the way David carried himself, the way his words cut through excuses and left no room for argument. Carl hesitated, glancing nervously between David and Marcus. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his grip on the gun. By now, several neighbors had begun to gather outside their homes. Some peeked through curtains, too afraid to intervene, while others cautiously stepped onto their porches to get a better view. A few even pulled out their phones to record the scene, though none dared to speak up. The tension was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Marcus, meanwhile, remained silent. He wanted to say something, to defend himself or thank his dad, but the lump in his throat made it impossible. All he could do was watch as his father took another step forward, closing the distance between himself and Carl. "Let me make one. Thing clear," David said, his voice dropping lower but carrying more weight with each word. "You don't know me, and you don't know what I'm capable of, but I promise you this. If you so much as twitch that trigger finger, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." Carl swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling under the pressure. He opened his mouth to respond but found no words. The gun wavered in his hand, and for a fleeting second it looked like he might actually fire it. But then sanity, or perhaps fear, prevailed, and he slowly lowered the weapon. Still shaking, he shoved it back into his jacket pocket and took a stumbling step backward. "That's better," David said, his tone softening ever so slightly. "Now let's talk about why we're here." Carl blinked rapidly, trying to process what had just happened. One moment he had been the enforcer, the guy everyone relied on to keep the neighborhood in line. The next, he was standing in front of a man who seemed ready to dismantle him without breaking a sweat. It was humiliating and terrifying. I was just following protocol," Carl muttered weakly, his earlier bluster completely gone. He was making noise, disrupting the peace. David raised an eyebrow. "Disrupting the peace with a skateboard?" He shook his head, almost amused by the absurdity of it all. "Do you hear yourself right now? You pulled a gun on a kid because he was skating in his own driveway. Does that sound reasonable to you?" Carl didn't answer. He couldn't. The realization of how far he'd overstepped was sinking in, and it was suffocating. He glanced around at the growing crowd of onlookers, their faces a mix of shock, disapproval, and curiosity. Some were whispering to each other, others simply stared, unable to look away from the spectacle unfolding before them. Seeing an opportunity to de-escalate further, David turned his attention to Marcus. "Are you okay, son?" he asked gently, his voice filled with genuine concern. Marcus nodded, though his hands were still trembling. "Yeah, Dad, I'm fine." David gave him a reassuring smile before turning back to Carl. "Listen carefully," he said, his tone shifting once again to something colder, harder. "This isn't about skateboarding or noise ordinances anymore. This is about accountability. If you ever come near my family again, or anyone else in this neighborhood, with that kind of aggression, you'll answer to me. Do you understand?" Carl nodded quickly, eager to agree to anything that would end the confrontation. Yes, I understand." "Good." David crossed his arms over his chest, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the driveway. "Now leave, and think very carefully about your actions before you decide to enforce another rule." Without another word, Carl stumbled back to his golf cart, his face pale, and his hands visibly shaking. He climbed in, started the engine, and sped off, leaving behind a trail of dust and unanswered questions. As the sound of the cart faded into the distance, the neighborhood erupted into murmurs. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, some shaking, their heads in disbelief, while others whispered about calling the police. Marcus finally exhaled, the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding rushing out in a shaky sigh. "You handled that perfectly," David told him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You stayed calm, and you didn't escalate things. That takes real strength." Marcus managed a small smile, though his mind was still reeling. "Thanks, Dad, but how did you know what to do?" David chuckled softly. "Years of practice, kiddo, years of practice." For the rest of the evening, the incident dominated conversations throughout the neighborhood. Speculation ran wild about what exactly had transpired, and many wondered who David Johnson really was. Was he just a protective father, or was there more to his story? Little did they know, the truth was far more fascinating, and the ripple effects of this encounter were only beginning. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, the crowd of onlookers began to disperse. Some returned to their homes while others lingered, whispering among themselves about what they had just witnessed. The tension that had gripped the cul-de-sac slowly dissipated, replaced by a mix of relief and unease. For Marcus, the adrenaline rush was fading, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion. He leaned against the porch railing, his skateboard resting at his feet as he tried to process everything. David stood nearby, his arms still crossed, watching Carl's golf cart disappear around the corner. His expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes, something unspoken. It wasn't anger or satisfaction. It was resolve. This wasn't over. Not for him. Dad, Marcus said finally, breaking the silence. Why did you say all that stuff about accountability? I mean, do you think he'll actually listen? David turned to look at his son, his features softening. I don't know if he'll listen, he admitted. But sometimes people need to hear the truth, even if they don't want to. What happened here today wasn't just about rules or noise. It was about power, fear, and respect. And those are lessons everyone needs to learn. Marcus nodded. Slowly, though, he wasn't entirely sure he understood. He trusted his dad completely, but this felt bigger than anything they'd faced before. Do you think we should call the police? He asked hesitantly. David shook his head. Not yet, he replied. First, we need to make sure we have our facts straight, and maybe teach Mr. Hargrove a little more about who he's dealing with. The comment caught Marcus off guard. What do you mean? He asked. David hesitated for a moment, then let out a deep sigh. Come inside, he said, motioning toward the house. We need to talk. Inside the living room, David gestured for Marcus to sit down. He grabbed 2 bottles of water from the fridge and handed one to his son before taking a seat across from him. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The quiet hum of the ceiling fan filled the room, and the late afternoon light streamed through the windows, painting golden patterns on the carpet. Marcus, David began, his voice steady but tinged with seriousness. There's something I've never really told you about my past. Something that might help explain why I handled things the way I did today. Marcus frowned, curiosity piqued. You mean your job? You've always said you worked in security. That's true, David confirmed. But it's more complicated than that. Before I worked as a consultant, I spent years serving in an elite special forces unit. We were trained to handle high-stakes situations, things most people can't even imagine. Our missions took us all over the world into some of the toughest environments imaginable. Marcus's eyes widened. Wait, like Delta Force? David nodded. Yes, exactly like that. I didn't talk about it much because it's not something I'm proud of showing off. But today, when I saw that man pull a gun on you, a teenager, I couldn't stay quiet. I had to step in. And part of stepping in means letting him and anyone else know that they're messing with someone who knows how dangerous situations can escalate. Marcus sat back, stunned. He had always known his dad was strong and capable, but hearing this side of him was surreal. So, does that mean you could have, taken him down or something? David chuckled softly. Physically? Absolutely. But that's not the point. The point is, I've seen what happens when people misuse power or weapons. I've seen lives destroyed because someone thought they were above the law, and I won't let that happen to you or anyone else in this family. Marcus swallowed, hard, feeling a swell of pride and gratitude. Thanks, Dad. I don't know what I'd do without you. You'll never have to find out, David said firmly. Then, after a pause, he added, but there's another reason I wanted to tell you this. People like Carl, they rely on intimidation. They think having authority gives them the right to act however they want. But real strength isn't about scaring others. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Later, that evening, word of the confrontation spread quickly through the neighborhood. Videos recorded by neighbors surfaced online almost instantly, capturing Carl's aggressive behavior and David's calm but authoritative response. Comments poured in, ranging from outrage to disbelief. Many viewers questioned why an HOA officer would carry a firearm, let alone point it at a child. Others praised David for his composure and demanded accountability. One video in particular went viral. In it, David could be heard saying, "If you ever come near my family again, with that kind of aggression, you'll answer to me." The clip resonated deeply with viewers, sparking conversations about racial profiling, community policing, and the misuse of authority. By the time night fell, local news outlets had picked up the story. Reporters arrived in the neighborhood, setting up cameras and microphones outside the Johnsons' home. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, debating whether the incident reflected broader issues within the HOA, or if it was simply an isolated case of poor judgment. David watched the growing media circus from his living room window, his expression unreadable. When Marcus asked if they should speak to the reporters, David shook his head. "Not tonight," he said. "Let them speculate for now. Tomorrow we'll decide how to handle it." The next morning, David made a phone call. On the other end of the line was an old friend from his military days, a lawyer who specialized in civil rights cases. After explaining the situation, David asked for advice on filing a formal complaint against Carl and the HOA. The lawyer agreed to take on the case, promising to ensure justice was served. Meanwhile, Marcus found himself at the center of attention, at school. Friends approached him throughout the day asking for details about the incident. Some offered support while others joked about how cool it was to have a dad who could intimidate an armed HOA officer. Marcus appreciated the camaraderie but couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease. He knew the situation was far from over. That afternoon, the HOA board held an emergency meeting to discuss the fallout. Several members expressed concern about Carl's actions, citing potential legal ramifications and damage to the organization's reputation. Others defended him, arguing that maintaining order required tough decisions. The debate grew heated, reflecting the divided opinions of the community. In the end, the board voted unanimously to suspend Carl pending an investigation. They also announced plans to review their policies and provide additional training for officers on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. Back at home, David and Marcus talked about what came next. "This isn't just about us," David explained. "It's about setting an example for the neighborhood, for the HOA, and for anyone who thinks they can abuse their power. We're not backing down." Marcus nodded, determination replacing his earlier uncertainty. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together," he said. As the days passed, the incident continued to spark change. Conversations about race, privilege, and accountability became more common in the neighborhood. Some residents pushed for reforms within the HOA, while others advocated for its dissolution altogether. Though tensions remained, the seeds of progress had been planted. For Marcus, the experience marked a turning point. He realized that standing up for himself and others wasn't just about courage. It was about using his voice to challenge injustice. And with his dad by his side, he knew he could face whatever challenges lay ahead. The days following the incident brought a whirlwind of activity to the neighborhood. What had started as a tense confrontation between Carl Hargrove and the Johnson family quickly spiraled into a larger conversation about accountability, authority, and systemic issues within gated communities. For David and Marcus, life became a delicate balancing act, navigating public attention, legal proceedings, and the emotional aftermath of the event. David wasted no time in taking action. With the help of his lawyer friend, he filed a formal complaint against Carl and the HOA, citing multiple violations, brandishing a firearm, racial profiling, and misuse of authority. The case garnered widespread media coverage, with reporters flocking to the neighborhood for interviews and updates. To protect their privacy, David declined most requests, but he did agree to one televised interview, a decision that would prove pivotal. On the day of the interview, David sat beside Marcus on a modest couch in their living room, dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt. Across from them was a seasoned journalist named Lisa Monroe, known for her empathetic yet probing style. Cameras rolled as Lisa began by asking David to recount the events leading up to the confrontation. "It all started with something simple," David explained, his voice calm but steady. "My son Marcus was skateboarding in our driveway, a completely normal activity. Then Mr. Hargrove arrived, accusing him of violating some obscure noise ordinance. When Marcus tried to explain himself, things escalated far beyond reason." Lisa nodded thoughtfully. "And at what point did you step in?" "When I saw a gun pointed at my child," David replied without hesitation. His tone hardened slightly, though his demeanor remained composed. "That's when I realized this wasn't just about rules or noise anymore. This was about someone abusing their power and putting a teenager's life in danger." The camera panned briefly to Marcus, who sat quietly beside his father. Though visibly nervous, he held his head high, exuding quiet strength. Lisa turned her attention to him next. Marcus, how did it feel to have a weapon pointed at you, and what went through your mind during those moments? Marcus hesitated, glancing at his dad before answering. It felt scary, like really scary, but also confusing. I mean, I wasn't doing anything wrong, I was just skating. And then, suddenly there's this guy yelling at me and pulling out a gun. All I could think was, why is this happening? His words resonated deeply with viewers, many of whom were parents themselves. Social media exploded with reactions, ranging from outrage to heartfelt messages of support. Hashtags like, "Yeah, justice for Marcus" and "accountability matters" trended nationwide, amplifying calls for reform within homeowners associations and similar organizations. As the interview continued, Lisa shifted focus to David's background. You mentioned previously serving in an elite special forces unit. How has that experience shaped the way you approach this situation? David leaned forward slightly, choosing his words carefully. Being in special forces taught me discipline, strategy, and the importance of staying calm under pressure. But more than anything, it showed me the consequences of unchecked power. In situations where people are armed or given authority, they have a responsibility to use it wisely. When they don't, lives can be ruined. He paused, letting the gravity of his statement sink in. I didn't want Marcus, or anyone else, to grow up thinking it's okay for someone to threaten them simply because they're enforcing rules. That's not leadership, that's bullying, and it needs to stop. The audience erupted in applause, both in the studio and online. Viewers praised David not only for his bravery, but also for his eloquence and wisdom. By the end of the segment, it was clear that the story had transcended its local roots, becoming a catalyst for broader discussions about privilege, race, and community policing. Meanwhile, tensions within the neighborhood reached a boiling point. While many residents supported the Johnsons, others rallied behind Carl, claiming he had been unfairly vilified. A small group even organized a petition to reinstate him, arguing that his actions were justified under the HOA's strict guidelines. This divide created friction among neighbors, turning once friendly faces into strangers. One evening, as Marcus walked home from school, he encountered Mrs. Peterson, an elderly woman who lived 2 houses down. She was watering her flowers as usual, but today her expression was unusually stern. Your dad's making quite a fuss, isn't he? She remarked, her tone laced with disapproval. Not everyone agrees with how he handled things. Marcus stopped in his tracks, caught off guard by her comment. Handled things? My dad was protecting me, he shot back, his voice rising despite his efforts to stay calm. What would you do if someone pulled a gun on your grandson? Mrs. Peterson pursed her lips, clearly uncomfortable. That's not the point, she muttered. Rules exist for a reason. People shouldn't just ignore them whenever it suits them. Her words stung, but Marcus refused to let them shake him. Rules are important, he said firmly. But so is treating people fairly. Maybe instead of worrying about rules, we should focus on being kind to each other. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Mrs. Peterson standing silently in her garden. Though the encounter left him frustrated, it reinforced his determination to stand by his principles. Back at home, David received news from their lawyer. Carl had been formally charged with reckless endangerment and unlawful possession of a firearm. Additionally, several former colleagues came forward, alleging past instances of aggressive behavior. These revelations further damaged Carl's credibility and strengthened the Johnsons' case. Despite the progress, David knew the fight wasn't over. He spent hours reviewing documents, preparing statements, and strategizing with their attorney. At night, after Marcus went to bed, he often sat alone in the living room staring at photos from his military days. Memories of missions and comrades flooded his mind, reminding him of why he had chosen this path, to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. One evening, as he flipped through an old photo album, Marcus joined him on the couch. Dad, he began hesitantly, do you ever regret telling people about your past? I mean, now everyone knows. David smiled faintly, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "No, I don't regret it," he replied. "Sometimes keeping secrets feels easier, but the truth has a way of coming out eventually. If sharing my story helps hold people accountable and makes others think twice before misusing their power, then it's worth it." Marcus nodded slowly, processing his father's words. "Do you think things will get better around here? Or will it always be divided?" "I think change takes time," David admitted. "Some people will resist it while others will embrace it. But every step forward matters, even the small ones. And remember, Marcus, you're part of that change too. Your voice matters just as much as mine." Encouraged by his father's optimism, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. Over the next few weeks, he began speaking out more openly about his experiences, participating in school debates and community forums. He discovered a passion for advocacy, using his platform to highlight issues like racial profiling and youth rights. By the time Carl's trial date arrived, the entire neighborhood, and much of the country, was watching closely. Testimonies revealed shocking details about Carl's history of erratic behavior and questionable enforcement tactics. Witnesses described incidents where he had bullied residents into compliance, often targeting minority families disproportionately in the EDR, and Carl was found guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to probation and mandated anger management classes, along with a permanent ban from working in any law enforcement capacity. The verdict sent shockwaves through the community, prompting the HOA board to implement sweeping reforms. New policies were introduced to ensure transparency and fairness, including stricter oversight of officers and mandatory training on cultural sensitivity. Several residents even pushed for the dissolution of the HOA altogether, arguing that such organizations fostered division rather than unity. For Marcus and David, the outcome brought a mix of relief and vindication. They celebrated quietly at home, savoring the knowledge that their courage had sparked meaningful change. But they also recognized that the journey was far from over. As David often reminded Marcus, justice wasn't a destination, it was an ongoing effort. And so life in the neighborhood began to shift. Conversations that had once been avoided were now embraced, fostering greater understanding and empathy. Neighbors who had been divided found common ground, united by a shared desire to create a safer, kinder community. Through it all, Marcus carried his skateboard everywhere, a symbol of resilience and freedom. No longer afraid to glide down the cul-de-sac, he skated with confidence, knowing that his father, and countless others, had his back. Together, they proved that standing up for what's right could transform fear into hope, chaos into clarity, and silence into strength. The aftermath of Carl's conviction rippled through the neighborhood like a stone dropped into still water. What had once been a quiet, predictable community was now alive with conversations about accountability, fairness, and change. The HOA scandal became a turning point, not just for the residents but also for Marcus and David, who found themselves at the center of a movement they hadn't intended to start. In the weeks following the trial, the Johnsons received an outpouring of support from people across the country. Messages poured in via email, social media, and even handwritten letters. Some were from parents thanking David for standing up to injustice. Others came from teenagers like Marcus, inspired by his courage. Strangers shared their own stories of being unfairly targeted by authority figures, revealing how widespread such issues truly were. Despite the positive feedback, not everyone in the neighborhood welcomed the changes. A small faction of residents remained loyal to Carl, arguing that he had merely been doing his job. They criticized the reforms implemented by the HOA board, claiming they undermined the organization's purpose. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, occasionally boiling over during heated discussions at association meetings or casual encounters on the street. One afternoon, as Marcus walked home from school, he overheard two neighbors debating loudly near the community mailbox. "This whole thing is ridiculous," one man said, shaking his head. "We're letting kids dictate how we run this place now? Next thing you know, there won't be any rules left." His companion nodded in agreement. "Exactly. People need to stop making mountains out of molehills. It was just a little noise complaint. Marcus clenched his fists, tempted to intervene but knowing it wouldn't help. Instead, he took a deep breath and reminded himself of what his dad always said. Sometimes silence speaks louder than words. Still, the comment lingered in his mind, fueling his determination to keep pushing for progress. While Marcus navigated the complexities of newfound fame, David focused on ensuring lasting change within the community. He attended HOA meetings regularly, advocating for policies that prioritized empathy and inclusivity. At first, some board members dismissed him as overly idealistic, but his calm persistence and undeniable credibility eventually won them over. During one particularly contentious meeting, a proposal to eliminate fines for minor infractions sparked fierce debate. Opponents argued that leniency would lead to chaos, while supporters insisted it was a step toward fostering goodwill among residents. When the moderator called on David to speak, he stood up slowly, his presence commanding attention without needing to raise his voice. "Rules are important," he began, addressing the room, "but so is compassion. When we enforce policies that penalize people for harmless mistakes, we create fear instead of trust. Is that really the kind of community we want to live in?" His question hung in the air, prompting murmurs of agreement from several attendees. Though not everyone was convinced, the motion passed narrowly, marking a small but significant victory for reform. Outside of meetings, David mentored other fathers in the neighborhood, sharing insights from his military career about leadership and conflict resolution. He emphasized the importance of leading by example and treating others with dignity, regardless of their background or circumstances. These informal sessions fostered connections among men who might otherwise have never interacted, breaking down barriers and building bridges. Inspired by his father's actions, Marcus began exploring ways to channel his experiences into something meaningful. With encouragement from teachers and friends, he started a youth advocacy group called Skate for Change. The initiative aimed to empower young people to speak up against injustice and promote unity within their communities. Every Saturday morning, Marcus and a growing group of volunteers gathered at the local park to skate, share stories, and brainstorm ideas for creating positive change. They organized workshops on topics like conflict resolution, mental health awareness, and civic engagement, drawing participants from all walks of life. What began as a small gathering soon evolved into a vibrant movement, attracting attention from local news outlets and nonprofit organizations. One weekend, the group hosted a community event featuring guest speakers, art exhibits, and performances. Parents brought their children, curious to learn more about the cause. Marcus delivered a heartfelt speech, reflecting on the incident with Carl and the lessons he'd learned since then. "Standing up for yourself isn't easy," he admitted, his voice steady despite the crowd. "But when we stay silent, we let fear win. Today I'm asking each of you to find your voice, to use it to make our world better, kinder, and fairer. Together, we can build a future where no one has to feel afraid because of who they are or what they love." The audience erupted in applause, many rising to their feet in admiration. For Marcus, the moment was both humbling and empowering, a reminder that his journey was far from over. As the months passed, the neighborhood began to heal. Conversations that had once been taboo became commonplace, fostering greater understanding between residents. Families who had previously kept to themselves started reaching out, forming friendships across cultural and socioeconomic lines. Even Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman who had criticized David earlier, approached Marcus one day with a tentative smile. "I've been thinking about what you said," she confessed, her tone softer than before. Maybe I was too quick to judge. Your family has done a lot for this community, and I wanted to say thank you." Marcus blinked in surprise but accepted her apology graciously. "It's okay," he replied. "We're all learning together." Her words marked a turning point for many in the neighborhood, signaling a shift toward reconciliation and mutual respect. While old habits died hard, the seeds of change continued to grow, nurtured by acts of kindness and courage. By the end of the year, the HOA had undergone a complete transformation. Gone were the days of rigid enforcement and arbitrary, Penalties. In their place stood policies designed to uplift rather than oppress. Officers received extensive training on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity, ensuring they approached conflicts with care and professionalism. Meanwhile, Marcus and David embraced their roles as advocates, using their platform to inspire others. They gave talks at schools, community centers, and conferences, sharing their story and encouraging listeners to challenge injustice wherever they saw it. Their message resonated deeply, reminding audiences that true strength lies not in domination, but in compassion. Though scars remained both visible and invisible, the Johnsons found solace in knowing they had made a difference. For Marcus, the experience taught him resilience, empathy, and the power of standing firm in the face of adversity. For David, it reinforced his belief in the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Together, they proved that change was possible, even in the unlikeliest of places. As Marcus skated down the cul-de-sac one crisp autumn evening, the golden light of sunset casting long shadows behind him, he felt a profound sense of peace. Life in the neighborhood wasn't perfect, but it was moving in the right direction, and for now that was enough. As the seasons changed, so did the rhythm of life in the neighborhood. The once tense atmosphere gave way to a quieter, more reflective energy. The scars left by Carl's actions and the subsequent trial were still visible, but they no longer dominated daily conversations. Instead, residents began focusing on rebuilding trust and fostering connections, a process that required patience, humility, and effort from everyone involved. A community reimagined. The HOA board worked tirelessly to implement reforms, transforming the organization into something its members could genuinely support. Monthly meetings became open forums where residents could voice concerns, suggest improvements, and celebrate victories together. Gone were the rigid agendas and fear-based enforcement. In their place stood collaborative discussions aimed at creating a sense of belonging for all. One of the most significant changes was the introduction of a youth advisory council. Comprised of teenagers like Marcus, the council provided young people with a platform to share their perspectives and influence decision-making. Their input led to initiatives such as designated skateboarding zones, community art projects, and mentorship programs connecting kids with adults who shared their interests. Marcus played an active role in shaping these efforts, often collaborating with his dad to ensure policies reflected both practicality and compassion. Together, they championed ideas that encouraged creativity and inclusivity, proving that rules didn't have to stifle joy. They could enhance it. David's legacy of leadership. For David, this period marked a new chapter in his life. Though he had always been a private person, he embraced his role as a leader within the community, using his experiences to guide others. His military background continued to inspire respect, but it was his wisdom and empathy that truly resonated with those around him. He became a regular speaker at local events, sharing stories from his career while emphasizing universal lessons about courage, teamwork, and integrity. Being strong isn't about overpowering others, he often said. It's about lifting them up, even when it's hard. His words struck a chord with audiences of all ages, prompting many to reconsider how they approached challenges in their own lives. Fathers looked to him as a model of balanced leadership, while mothers appreciated his unwavering dedication to protecting his family. Even children admired him, seeing him not just as Marcus's dad, but as a hero in his own right. Despite the accolades, David remained humble, deflecting praise onto others whenever possible. "I'm just one person," he would say with a smile. "Real change happens when we work together." Marcus comes into his own. While David inspired adults, Marcus inspired the younger generation. Through Skate for Change, he created a safe space where teens could express themselves freely without fear of judgment. The group grew rapidly, attracting members from neighboring towns and even drawing attention from national organizations focused on youth empowerment. One of their proudest achievements was organizing an annual event called Unity Day, held at the park. It featured skateboarding competitions, live music performances, and workshops on topics ranging from mental health to environmental activism. Local businesses donated food and supplies, turning the gathering into a celebration of diversity and resilience. During the second Unity Day, Marcus stood on stage overlooking a sea of smiling faces. Families picnicked on blankets, kids raced around with balloons, and skaters performed daring tricks to cheers from the crowd. It was a far cry from the tense cul-de-sac where everything had begun. "Look around you," Marcus said into the microphone, his voice filled with emotion. "This is what happens when we choose kindness over fear, understanding over division. We're stronger together, and I believe we can keep building a world where everyone feels safe and valued." The audience erupted in applause, waving signs bearing slogans like, "Together we rise and change starts with us." For Marcus, the moment symbolized how far they'd come and how much further they could go. Lessons learned as time passed, the neighborhood transformed in subtle yet profound ways. Conversations about race, privilege, and accountability became normalized, replacing the awkward silences that had once defined uncomfortable interactions. Residents learned to listen actively, ask questions openly, and challenge biases they hadn't realized they held. Even former critics of the Johnsons softened their stance, acknowledging the positive impact of their advocacy. Mrs. Peterson, who had initially opposed the reforms, joined the HOA board and became a vocal supporter of inclusive policies. Her journey mirrored that of many others, people who had resisted change but ultimately embraced it because they saw its benefits firsthand. Children, too, absorbed these lessons, carrying them forward into their own lives. They learned to stand up for friends being bullied, to question unfair treatment, and to seek common ground rather than conflict. In doing so, they ensured that the values of justice and empathy would endure long after the headlines faded. Looking ahead, though the incident with Carl had sparked monumental change, it also served as a reminder of how fragile progress could be. David often reminded Marcus and anyone else who would listen that vigilance was key. "We've made strides," he said during a family dinner one evening, "but there's always more work to do. Justice isn't a destination, it's a journey." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, twirling spaghetti on his fork. "Do you think things will ever feel normal again?" he asked. "Like not perfect, but okay?" David chuckled softly. "Normal is overrated," he replied. "What matters is that we keep moving forward even if it's messy sometimes. Life doesn't give us easy answers, it gives us chances to grow." A quiet evening. Months later, on a crisp spring evening, David and Marcus sat side by side on the front porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky glowed orange and pink, casting warm hues over the quiet streets. Skateboard wheels clicked rhythmically in the distance as neighborhood kids practiced tricks under the fading light. "You know," Marcus said after a long pause, "I never thought I'd see the day when people cheered for me skating instead of yelling at me to stop." David smiled, resting an arm on the railing. "That's because you showed them what skating means to you. You turned something they saw as disruptive into something beautiful." Marcus grinned, leaning back in his chair. "And you taught me how to stand up for myself, not just with words, but with action." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood coming alive with laughter and chatter. For the first time in a long time, it felt peaceful, not because problems had disappeared, but because they knew they had the strength to face whatever came next. A new beginning. Life in the neighborhood wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was better. People cared more about each other, celebrated differences, and worked together to solve problems. The HOA evolved into a force for good, prioritizing connection over control. And Marcus and David, they continued leading by example, proving that even in the face of adversity, hope and courage could pave the way for lasting change. As Marcus rolled his skateboard down the driveway one last time before heading inside, he glanced back at his dad, who gave him a thumbs up. Together they had weathered a storm and emerged stronger, not just as individuals, but as a family and a community. And as the stars began to twinkle above, Marcus couldn't help but feel grateful for the challenges that had shaped him, for the father who had guided him, and for the future that lay ahead, full of endless possibilities.